If you don't count sleeping, most people spend more hours working than doing anything else during their adult lives. From the time we leave high school to the time we retire, a third of our waking hours are spent trying to earn a living. And with email following us everywhere we go, that percentage is on the rise. If we loved our jobs, no big deal. But most of us don't. Gallup, the big survey research firm, recently found that 60% of people say they're unhappy and feel emotionally detached at work. About the same amount say they're under tremendous stress on a daily basis. And almost a quarter say they're downright miserable.
Some are calling it the employee burnout epidemic. 7% of employers said that stress and burnout are issues for their workforce.
A new report out today from the U.S. Surgeon General is warning that the American workplace needs to change.
Does anybody want to work anymore?
Many workers are going through a reckoning where they're asking themselves what they want out of work.
How to fix it? Yeah, sure, more money is always nice. But it's not the key. People want their managers to be better listeners and advisors. They want to feel cared about, not like replaceable cogs in a machine.
A lot of people, especially younger generations, millennials and Gen Z, are underserved in their spiritual lives. They have a lot of unmet longings for meaning and belonging and purpose, for feeling part of something bigger than themselves. Workplaces are noticing their employees showing up with these longings that are going unmet.
That's Angie Thurston, a co-founder of Sacred Design Lab and one of the instructors at Harvard Business School's course, The Spiritual Lives of Leaders. And she thinks part of the problem is that we used to fulfill those needs through religion. But these days, at least in terms of time and focus, work has taken religion's place for many people. It's where they socialize, or at least attempt to. It's where they try to find a sense of purpose, usually to little avail. But according to Christian theologian and entrepreneur Curtis Chang, it doesn't have to be that way.
The calling for us as organizational, institutional beings is to not check our spirituality at the door. When we arrive at those organizations, we bring our whole selves and our whole beings to them because we're human, and we're now participating in a human enterprise called the organization.
Normally, if we don't like doing something, we quit. But when it comes to work, most people don't have that luxury. So if we want to be happier, if we want to find meaning in the world and ways to make it better, maybe one way to start is for workplaces to take a page from the wisdom of spiritual traditions. Another, according to business professor Subi Rangan, is for corporations to start thinking of themselves as having moral responsibilities in the world, not just financial ones.
The product of the economy is us and our relations. This is what we're producing. The economy is not about output, it's about outcomes. Fairness, dignity, trust, well-being.
I'm Dave DeSteno, and this is How God Works. Religion was always a big part of Angie Thurston's life, but it wasn't your typical experience of religion.
My parents raised me studying a spiritual text called the Urantia book, which most people have never heard of.
I hadn't, but it turns out the Urantia book was written sometime in the early 20th century by an unknown author living somewhere in Chicago. It aims to bring science, religion, and philosophy together and lays out a unique concept of God and human spiritual progress.
That was kind of the centerpiece of our family's spiritual life and practice. And there are students of that text all over the world, but there's no tradition or religious structure surrounding it. And so essentially I grew up religious but unaffiliated from the beginning. And I think that that kind of positioned me to be aware of that as a possibility in the broader culture, that you could be both personally religious and institutionally unaffiliated.
And while religion was important to her, she didn't set out to be a spiritual leader or thinker. She started in the theater. But she couldn't help noticing the spiritual factors at work there too.
It seemed as though when we came together and co-created something that was bigger than ourselves, something transcendent was happening. It led me to wonder, where might people like me be going and finding spaces where they can touch on community and meaning and purpose? So I just started noticing how there were these sort of secular environments that seemed to be standing in for religion-like functions. So whether that was fitness communities or arts communities, maker spaces, or justice movements. And in the meantime, because I was personally seeking, I started to discover that I was part of a phenomenon. I think I checked an online dating box for spiritual but not religious, which was the first time I heard that phrase, and then started to wonder, what does that mean? And who are all of these people that seem to describe themselves that way?
To try to answer some of these questions, Angie decided to enroll at Harvard Divinity School, where she met Casper ter Kuile, who you might remember from our very first episode. Together, Angie and Casper started to study how some secular environments were standing in for religion, and they quickly realized organizations needed more support to meet these challenges. So along with Reverend Sue Phillips, they founded Sacred Design Lab.
Sacred Design Lab, which we founded in 2019, we call it a soul-centered research and development lab, but it's basically a nonprofit that tries to work with leaders of both nonprofit and for-profit organizations on the question of supporting spiritual well-being. So there's this sense that a lot of people, especially younger generations, millennials and Gen Z, are underserved in their spiritual lives, that they have a lot of unmet longings for meaning and belonging and purpose, for feeling part of something bigger than themselves. And so we found that a lot of the leaders in these positions were being treated like pastors by the people in their care, because these folks didn't have anywhere else to go. So you have examples like people turning to their soul cycle instructors and asking, should I put my kid on antidepressants? Or will you officiate my wedding? People holding funerals in a CrossFit gym, people going to a makerspace at 3 a.m. and welding instead of self-harming. These kinds of outsized roles that these communities are taking on in people's lives, and the leaders especially, because of the absence of other people to fill those roles. So having said that, I then turned to the workplace more specifically. And I think some of what brings these leaders to us is a feeling that they may not be able to articulate, a feeling that they are being called upon to go deeper with the people in their organizations, and a sense that they haven't been trained for that. They don't know how, they don't know where to look, and they don't even necessarily know how to talk about it, but they have this sense of, in many cases, a sort of imposter syndrome, maybe for the first time in their leadership. These leaders really being asked to sort of step up spiritually and morally in their roles, and not necessarily knowing how.
That's where Angie and her team come in. They draw on the collective wisdom of spiritual traditions to find rituals and practices that may help fill that gap.
Something like the idea of covenant, right, which is present in many religious traditions. It might be seen as sort of a commitment or a vow, right? But often we'll talk about covenant between a person and God, or between God and a peoplehood. Our team at Sacred Design Lab has a covenant that we use. It's both a noun and a verb. We have a written page of text that we evolve over the years as things change, that is essentially a set of aspirational agreements of how we will be together. We read it at our team meeting every week, and we have 15 minutes or so to just check in about how we're doing with that. And, there are some very, very powerful and fundamental distinctions between a covenant and a contract, right? A contract being what's often used in corporate spaces, and which is essentially a litigious document that says, I promise not to do this, and if I don't live up to my promise, you can sue me. And the covenant is essentially saying, we will fall short because we're human, but here is how we aspire to be together. When our hearts are in the right place, when we are reaching toward our higher selves, this is what we commit to. And so one of the just very practical implications of that is that anytime my colleagues and I have something that comes up interpersonally, something that's bothering us or a conflict, we have a dedicated time and space to go to where we can talk about that.
This might sound just like another mission statement. That thing most groups have to signal their values. But ritualizing a time to come together and reflect on the covenant, to reaffirm it and to allow people to ask for forgiveness when they fall short. That changes the environment dramatically. From a place where words are cheap to where they're meaningful. From a place where failure is met with scorn and stress to one where it's met with forgiveness and care. Changes like this can fundamentally alter how people feel and perform at work. But what about another aspect of religion? Community.
The idea of meaning-oriented small groups. So there are some organizations that have already tried versions of this. The Etsy Den program is one example of this. You know, Etsy, the tech company, they have this idea of dens, which they're employees who they make sure they don't have any direct reports in a group. They sort of vet who's in the group together. And it becomes a space that I think ostensibly is about sort of leadership development at first, but then over time, it graduates into something where people are just being able to share vulnerably, right, in a workplace setting, and that makes them feel connected to each other, which in turn makes them feel more connected to the place that they work.
This idea of connection, of empathy, of working with a manager and team who care about you and your development might sound a bit fluffy in the world of business. Like, sure, that'd be nice, but who has the time for that? Does it really matter? Turns out, it does. Let me give you an example. In 2009, Google conducted a study to try and find out why some of its teams worked better than others. Initially, they assumed that technical expertise would make the difference. Google is a tech company after all. But as it turned out, technical experience came in last among the 8 factors that predicted achievement and satisfaction at work. One of the qualities in a manager that best predicted a team's achievement was having a supportive and caring demeanor. That meant making time for one-on-one meetings to support team members' growth and creating an environment where coworkers solve problems together. Yes, technical know-how helped, but really smart managers who weren't empathetic created a less happy and less productive environment. This is one example of why adapting some practices from spiritual traditions can help. Ritualizing things like a covenant or a gratitude practice makes it easier to foster qualities like empathy and connection in a group. This doesn't mean it's an easy thing to do, though. So I asked Angie how it's going.
One of the prevailing trends that has occurred with the people we've partnered with, the specific leaders, is that they've left their jobs. So as far as the efficacy of our firm, in a weird way, I'm proud of it because I think some of what we've done is actually accompany them as they have begun to give themselves permission to engage in some of this meaning making. They're starting to feel like perhaps there's dissonance there between the way they feel internally and what they get to do on a daily basis. They've found themselves essentially outgrowing the paradigm that their organization is in. When they came to us, their hope was to actually change that paradigm. And that broadly might have to do with fostering an environment or even creating products that would be more meaningful, connective, and purposeful. And in the process, they ran up against some of the limitations of their workplace and perhaps the priorities of their colleagues that would allow those changes to occur. It becomes a question of calling almost, right? I can't unsee what I've seen. And so now I have the choice of whether to try to stuff myself down or actually go pursue my heart's desire.
Do you get frustrated sometimes when it comes to how do we actually implement this for the hundreds or thousands of people that are working in these enterprises?
Absolutely. And of course, a huge part of that is just the profit motive and the fact that these organizations have that at the center, and so there is kind of a fundamental clash there in some cases, just about being able to explore something when it may not be obviously profitable.
That desire for profit doesn't only make it hard to start spiritually oriented initiatives in companies. Sometimes it also corrupts them, like Amazon.
I wanted to provide a place that's quiet that people could go and focus on their mental and emotional well-being.
There's an interactive kiosk where...
Yeah, it's exactly what it sounds like. Amazon put these booths in their warehouses where overworked and overstressed employees can sit for a few minutes under an electric light meant to give off the hue of a blue sky while they read cheery phrases on a monitor. To me, that's not meditation. It's a place to hide for a few minutes. And it's no wonder employees have nicknamed these booths the despair closets.
What we run up against is that when you have a one-off offering of a booth you can go into in a setting that is otherwise, frankly, exploitative for the person going into that booth, there's so much dissonance in that cannot be sustained. It's going to require leadership of these kinds of organizations that is actually able to see the bigger picture and actually willing to do what it takes to shift major elements of their culture so that they're life-giving and not exploitative, right? So that they actually have people's well-being at their core.
As a theologian and CEO of a consulting firm, Curtis Chang has a lot to say about how businesses can become more soulful. By the way, Curtis is also co-host of the wonderful podcast Good Faith with David French. And since I'm also someone who wears many hats, I was curious to know how he makes it all work.
Well, I really combine them under my relationship with God. That is the center of my life. And so it's the reality that integrates all of my different activities. And that's really, in some ways, my passion is to help people of faith, especially Christians, do a similar work of integration, because the reality is I'm not alone. We all wear different hats. We have a family hat, a work hat, a political hat. And how do we actually wear all of them together in a way that is coherent, cohesive, and gives life to us is really a pressing question for all of us to ask.
That's a really good point. And it kind of leads me into my next question, which is, what does it mean to run a business from a spiritually informed perspective?
Well, it really gets down to a core question, which is, what does it mean to bear the image of God? Because that is the central task that people at least in the Judeo-Christian narrative are given from very beginning in Genesis. We are told we are made in the image of God, and our task is to bear the image of God. And that traditionally has been interpreted in very individualistic terms, that somehow we bear the image of God solely as an individual. But if you actually look at the text, it actually has a collective dimension to it, shot through and through. And so you have to ask, well, how do human beings collectively, together with one another, bear and reflect the image of God? And I believe that that's really where institutions, where organizations of all kinds, regardless of what label you put to them, whether secular or religious, all organizations are human. They're all human organizations. They're made of human beings. The conceptual sort of door that I want to open for people of faith, especially for Christians, is to conceive of that imaging of God as having institutional dimensions as well. That we bear the image of God together when we participate in organizations in a way that reflects the character of God. Again, regardless of whether or not they are explicitly named as religious organizations, they're still human and therefore still participate in this higher calling.
So from a theological perspective, then, is it fair to say that business enterprises, because they are built by humans, have at that institutional level their own moral responsibility? That is, they are moral actors.
Absolutely. And again, this does not mean they have to subscribe to explicitly to a particular religion or much less proselytize. That's not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about, what is it that they are made to do? What is their purpose? What is their end telos, their end goal? And as a consultant, that's what I'm doing all the time. So my prior hat that I wore was I was a pastor. And people have asked me, well, how do you make the transition from being a pastor to being an organizational consultant? And I tell them, it's not really a transition. I'm doing the same work. As a pastor with an individual, I was really trying to get that individual to live up to who they were meant to be as created in the image of God. As a consultant, I'm doing the same thing with organizations. What were you brought into this world to do? What is your purpose? And therefore, how do you reflect that faithfully and accurately? And believe it or not, many organizations struggle to do that well.
Yeah, I worry too much, especially as organizations grow, that the telos is rewarding the shareholders, which isn't necessarily the best moral compass that you have. So when you think about what a telos should be for an organization, just in broad strokes, what do you think about its responsibilities both to the people who work there and to the larger world in which it exists?
Yeah. I think it does have both of those responsibilities. And I think that's a good way to put it, is that it has an internal responsibility to image God, and it has an external responsibility to image how God works in the world. So you could think of the internal imaging. I like it because of my Christian narrative. I think in Trinitarian terms. And the Trinitarian image is this beautiful picture of internal relationships within the very being of God that is marked by interdependence, overflowing love, and shared purpose. And if you look at the most healthy organizations internally, you really can trace the healthy ones to ones that bear some fidelity to those traits, and the unhealthy ones that end up distorting some of those traits.
A good example of this? You might be surprised.
I live in California, so my favorite go-to hamburger joint is In-N-Out. And it's great because it serves great food, but you'll also notice, anybody who's experienced In-N-Out, of just how different the employees are compared to your average fast food joint. You just pick up they're happier, they're more cheerful, they have more of a sense of hospitality. It's cleaner, and why is that? Well, a lot of that goes back to, as a Christian company, they've made a real commitment to treating them as human beings that are developing, that are thriving.
For East Coasters like me who have never heard of In-N-Out, it's a West Coast burger place. The same family has run it since 1948, and how they treat their employees is guided by their Christian faith.
So they pay higher than most industry wages. They help sponsor their educational opportunities. They're looking for ways to develop their own people. And that translates, I think, into the organizational culture. The best organizations have a mission in the world in which they are called to help human beings thrive. Certainly, helping to bring financial prosperity to their shareholders is one of those purposes, but it's just one. And it's certainly by no means only, or do I think it should be the highest that crowds out every other purpose in the world. And actually, Scripture is really clear about how organizations are meant to image more than just maximizing shareholder interests.
How? What does Scripture say on that?
Well, I'll just give you an example. Leviticus 19. So one way you can read the book of Leviticus, which is common to both the Judeo and Christian traditions, of course, is that it's really trying to give the institution of Israel some very practical instructions on how they are to image their Creator God. One of the instructions, Leviticus 19, is the commandment of the gleanings to the farming institutions in Israel. They were prohibited from harvesting their fields right up to the edges, right? In other words, another way to put it is they were prohibited from maximizing shareholder interests, from gleaning every single, last stalk for profit. They were explicitly prohibited. You cannot do that. You have to leave things on the margins for the people on the margins. So they were explicitly commanded, don't harvest, leave the gleanings, this part that was supposed to remain on the margins, for the widow, the orphan, the homeless, the immigrant.
When you give this message to business owners, how do they respond to it?
I think they actually are hungry for it. Think about your average, business owner. Like, really, at the end of the day, is it really, do they really want their legacy in the world? Here lies John Smith. I maximized shareholder interests. Like, is that a satisfying epitaph that that you want? I think deep down, human beings long for something greater, to participate in a larger story beyond themselves, beyond their narrow self-interests, and they're looking for that. But they don't necessarily know how that works, or they don't know what story that they're part of. And partly what I'm trying to do, at least for the Christian businessman, is to say, you're part of a larger story.
This sounds like a promising way to change how businesses work. But is big business ready for this view? These enterprises have huge reach, employing hundreds, thousands of people. So they can have a great impact, both on people's lives and the world at large. Does that mean they have a responsibility to care, to do good, and not just let profit guide their decisions.
Enterprises are sitting there in this choice. They have resources. They have a tremendous amount of creativity. And in fact, enterprises are mobilizing maybe 70 and 80% of all resources, human, financial, material, etc. So I think, yes, enterprises definitely have a role to play.
That's Subi Rangan, who holds the Abu Dhabi Crown Prince Court Endowed Chair on Societal Progress at INSEAD Business School. When it comes to educating the leaders of tomorrow, he's a major voice. And from Davos to the U.S. to the Middle East, he's got the ear of many CEOs. But Subi's message is a new one.
We would like to think of firms not just as economic and juridical actors, but also as moral actors. What does that imply for firms? Firstly, it implies that firms will not only do that which is most efficient, most profitable, that is, they will not only follow a economic rationality, but that firms will allocate resources and act in ways that also adhere to a moral rationality. So can firms be moral actors? Absolutely. And thank God there are firms all around the world that are moral actors. Not all of them survive, but there are enough that survive that we know that it can work in practice.
Subi's point is that businesses need to think about two P's. Yes, one is profit, but the other is propriety. What's the right thing, the moral thing to do?
The economic argument is generally look at the consequences, and the consequences usually are self-interested consequences. And that may lead to one set of actions, but the propriety standard would say, don't worry about the consequences, look at what's proper. And what's proper from a moral standpoint, even if that means less favorable consequences for you, the whole question of morality always goes back to some sacrifice. So if we say, well, morality must have something to do with love for other entities and beyond oneself and beyond one's own narrow conception, family, friends, etc., it means sacrifice. And sacrifice, I think, is almost always a characteristic that adheres with when we think of moral actions, because there are alternatives. And so this is where, should I be optimizing my taxes? How should I use somebody's data? All of these are now moral questions that enterprises are facing.
By bringing propriety into the picture, there's another goal, another value to consider besides profit. On a personal level, we do this all the time. While we could make money by cheating or lying, we may choose not to because it would hurt another person. Well, if we think of business enterprises as moral actors, the same would apply to them. They'd have to consider harm to others, not just benefits to their bottom line by selling your data, polluting your water, or overworking their employees.
Decision-making is very much information-driven. You look at the costs and the benefits, you look at the probabilities, and then you choose the one which gives you the highest expected value. Now, if you want to enter the moral space, then decisions will no longer do. These are choices. Decisions are about information. Choices are about identity. They're about who we are, not what's in it for us. For decision science, firms engage in rational reflection, which in philosophy we call prudential practical reasoning. If you want to do the moral stuff, the choices, then you have to engage in moral practical reasoning. If we can all be better versed with moral reasoning, then I think we can start to address the dilemmas. So, for example, Tata in India, a 150-year-old enterprise, has not really had to engage in corruption in order to become one of the most important and most successful enterprises in India. And it means walking away from certain things and saying, no, we will make money, but not that way. And if we make less money as a result, well, that's who we are. This is a choice.
It's for reasons like these that business leaders need to engage in thinking morally, to understand which choices, which sacrifices to make, Does that mean that religion and spirituality have a place here?
The starting point for me is an appreciation of our place in a larger cosmos, and appreciating that we somehow obtain our clean air and water and food and friendship and employment and material security, etc., and seeing that link magically. This is where I think moral emotions of the feeling of connectedness and interdependence, not as a burden, but as a marvel, can trigger a certain humility and caring and gratitude if people are given an opportunity and a reminder constantly of the wonder of which they are a part of, and it existed before they came, and hopefully should exist because of their actions after their time. If that's what spirituality is, a sense of a gift and a sense of gratitude, then I think it's absolutely crucial to this evolution that we would like enterprises to make, or we would like employees or investors or consumers to have and make. In the notion of human capital, which is so central to the economy, we've somehow narrowly thought of human capital as competence, and we have neglected character. And if spirituality is that energy that activates and engages my character and not just my competence, then it's essential.
But is this a view that business schools and the future leaders in them are buying into?
One of the things I would argue here in the business school where I'm at is we're training people for functions, accounting, strategy, marketing, etc. We should be training them for roles. It's a much broader, morally encompassing training. And what I see is when we invite students to do that, they are ready. There is a demand for a better paradigm and a better set of tools and practices that can be adopted. And we in business schools especially, we're moving late compared to how early we should have moved and how aggressively, but I think finally we are moving. It took 100 years for us to screw up the world so badly. I'm afraid it's going to take us a generation or two before we find our footing. But we're moving in the right direction.
This gives me hope. Hope that new generations of leaders will change the way businesses work, will embrace a view of care for their employees and the greater world around them, even if it shaves a few percentage points off profits. But the only way to do this, the only way to stay strong in the face of pressures to increase the bottom line, is to have a moral conviction. And that's where I think spirituality can play a role. Religious traditions don't just offer moral principles. They also offer techniques to help you stick to them, especially when facing difficult decisions. As Angie said, spiritual practices can be adapted to foster connection, compassion, and cooperation. Of course, business leaders have to be careful about adhering too closely to a given theology if their employees don't share the same one. Rules about what type of food can be served, which holidays people can take off, even what types of customers are valued, can be discriminatory. But most religions converge on the importance of things like love, kindness, and generosity. So there's no disagreement there. Organizations have the power to do good, and that means they should also have the responsibility to follow through on it. Next time on How God Works, forgiveness. We'll hear from a Yale theologian about how Christian tradition, despite the whole eye for an eye thing, sees forgiveness as essential to a happy life, even when it's hard.
It's always tension-filled, this cry for justice, as well as need or desire to forgive. But I think forgiveness and repentance can be enactment of our humanity. It's a return to this good from which we had fallen.
And from an evolutionary psychologist about why the more we forgive, the more likely we are to survive and thrive.
Study after study has shown that people with the propensity to forgive also tend to be higher in life satisfaction, happiness, just saying their lives are going well.
How God Works is hosted and written by me, Dave DeSteno. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman of Future Projects. Associate producer is Sophie Eisenberg. Our executive producer is Genevieve Sponsler. Music and post-production mix and master by Merritt Jacob. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. This podcast was also made possible with support from the John Templeton Foundation. If you want to learn more, you can head to my website, www.davedesteno.com.